G'day legends, I hope you're having a fantastic day and so far you are having a brilliant week. I know we're getting near to the end of the weekend for the Australians, looking forward to a long weekend. Now legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over. So in the very beginning, we're going to talk about manpower on the battlefield and are drones a replacement for that. We'll look at what a gentleman has said in relation to what Pete Hegseth said the other day at his meeting with all of the generals and colonels. We need to look at drones then increasing in capabilities. We need to look at long-range strikes, potential tomahawks too. Then we need to look at something you and I have been speaking about for some time. What we've seen is we have seen French operations against Russian tankers. And we need to look at the justification for this and what we have been warning about. And then we'll look at the maps. We'll have an overview of September. Then we'll look at Velika Novosilka. We'll look at Pokrovsk. We'll look at where there's a potential for a bloodbath, actually, in Konstantinivka. We'll look at that. And then we'll look at some geolocations, compare maps, the usual stuff. Okay, so a fair bit on the card today. So let's start with this delusional X post, but it's X. Half the bloody stuff is delusional. Now, Richard Stengel, he's the former Undersecretary of State to the Obama administration. On a side note, if this bloke wasn't American, he'd be in The Hague for Obama's drones. But let's look at what he said. The sad and dangerous irony here is that the future of war is happening in Ukraine, and it's drone warfare, which has nothing to do with dusty boots, beards, or how many push-ups you can do. That's what we need to be preparing for. And he shares New York Times article about Hegseth's lecture for the top military brass. Now, firstly, boots, beards, this sort of stuff, it comes into the discipline of making sure you get it right first time, every time in the military. That's why at basic training, you make your bed in the beginning, weeks on end, again and again, and it has to be perfect. That's the whole point of that. But Big Surge, in his fantastical article called Fighting to the Conclusion, which if you haven't read, go and read, it's still highly relevant, he says conventional sensibilities about operations are hardly obsolete. If anything, they've become more important in the age of the FPV drone due to how effective, how efficient, how deadly those systems are. Now, Richard here obviously has zero idea regarding the Russian and Ukrainian soldiers who are rucking in, marching in tens of kilometres with 30, 40, or easily that many kilograms of gear, potentially far higher if they're taking in more ammo or systems. So that is happening all the time. We hear Ukrainian soldiers talk all the time about the fitness of some of the older conscripts just isn't there. Now, Richard also, he has no idea how physically difficult fighting actually is, especially in urban terrain. Unbelievable. Anyone who's even done urban exercises will know you're out of breath as soon as you run up a couple of sets of stairs with all of your gear on and all your body armor, everything. Fitness just in the military too. This is why there's a minimum requirement to actually just get into the military. It prevents you from injury, of which the Army or the Air Force or the Navy will be paying for. Now, there's a lot of academics, and I've done a lot of reading about a potential war with China, and where there's a lot of agreement is there's going to be a lot of technology into the battlefield very early on, but what we will see is high destruction of things like satellites, of radars, of all sorts of equipment, and what could lead to, as people will say, fighting dark or gridlock. That you won't be able to bring into the fold these high-end technologies because everything's going to be jammed or taken down. And you are likely going to be back to the days of untraceable maps, compasses, and long-range marching capability on foot in small teams. And this style of traditional training is more important and more relevant now than ever. Now, we embrace technology on the battlefield as a lethality multiplier, but not as a replacement for conventional sensibilities or training or the discipline you need to get it right on the first time every time because you or one of your mates is going to get killed. Now, I've spoken about this before, but I thought it would be worth mentioning. I've spoken there a little bit about long-range capabilities, map, compass, small teams. We know in Australia that against a great state power, we are never going to have the latent or potential power. We are a very wealthy country, GDP individual, but as far as overall GDP, fairly low. Our population is tiny for the amount of territory we have. This is why the Australian forces, if there's some great invasion and they manage to land on the beaches, this is why the Australian forces are trained so highly in long-range small team strikes, because to get to Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, Perth, whatever of those cities, you're going to have to cross thousands of kilometres of open ground. Therefore, the infantry, special forces, armoured units, however, are trained to a very high level to work with a high level of individuality as well, to conduct kinetic strikes and basically stretch the logistics chain of, if it was China invade Australia, over thousands of kilometres of desert, and that you'd never actually get a larger force down to the south, the east, or the west from the north. And that thinking is still there. That's why we see the SAS with their long-range patrol success in everywhere from Vietnam through to Afghanistan. Now, I spoke there about drones increasing in capability, and this is a very, very interesting video right here. What we see, we are on board with a Iran-Russian drone, and what we are looking at is a Ukrainian train, and this drone then targets the locomotive at the front. Now, targeting locomotives with drones, this is not something new, although a lot of the time we see it more from quadrotor drones, which carry a significantly less warhead compared to something like this. Now, in the rest of the footage we see, there's further Garand strikes than against, I believe, energy facilities, but we're more focusing on the train. But with the train here, what we see is these drones, these are dodging aircraft in the air, specifically hunting for these two, and are able to carry out these strikes. Now, there has been a debate between myself and one of the guys behind the scenes who helps me that a Garand, he says it's not a drone. It fits more where a cheap cruise missile does, or at least a hybrid of them both, because it does not have, or has not had for some time, the characteristics of what makes drone a drone. It is set and forget and hit the target. Where a drone, by the definition, is an unmanned aircraft that flies without human pilot on board, instead being controlled remotely or flying autonomously. And what he said was, well, these were a set and forget, at least more in the beginning. They can't land, they can't change target. And until today, we haven't seen it strike a moving target on that train. Where a missile, by definition, is an airborne ranged weapon capable of self-propelled flight. That said, it's a hybrid of both at some point. Now, realistically, these definitions, they don't actually matter, but these are filling that hybrid position with large numbers and relatively inexpensive. Now, until very recently, we hadn't seen cameras on board these, nor had we seen these actually being able to steer, avoid interception, and strike a moving target. Now, what we see is the control of drones now dozens or hundreds of kilometres away, whether it's in Crimea or whether it is this strike here. And this has been the largest recent development in all of these long-range systems, is actually steering on board. You need to remember too that in any of these areas, whether it's down Ukrainian drones down to Crimea or these drones up here, I'll show you geolocation in a second, you need to remember these have to pass through a significant amount of air defence to get there. Now, I criticise many for overplaying strategic level strikes, because history shows the war has never been won by these alone, that this is a battlefield lethality multiplier. And that we do know too that great states have such a vast industry that you'd likely never have the amount of weapons needed to destroy it. Now, in my opinion, this still remains true to this day. That said, the wild card in this is China's industrial output and looking at drones like this. And I'm very open to being incorrect, and I think that that might be incorrect. If we saw a movement on Taiwan, if we saw that China was able to put 10,000 drones in the air every hour for days, how would that actually look? How would that change the battlefield forever? And if you don't think that China has the capability to do that, or the industrial output to do that. We look at the automotive industry where they're pumping out over 3,000 cars an hour, what are far more complex than something like this, and you're dealing with a very small area relative in Taiwan. So again, I'm open to that being incorrect. This drone, this was about 151 kilometers behind the closest point on the border in this Bobrovska region, Chernihiv Oblast, which is just to the northeast of Kyiv. Now let's look at further strikes. The SJW had this post here: US to provide Ukraine with intelligence for missile strikes deep inside Russia. Now they'll provide intel long range against Russian infrastructure, and the Trump administration is weighing sending Kyiv powerful weapons that could put more targets within range. Now, Trump has signed off allowing intelligence agencies or the Pentagon to aid Kyiv with strikes and NATO to provide similar support. Now, this is a signal that Trump is deepening his support, not reaching in his pockets, though, because peace talks, I don't think peace talks are stalled. I think they're done for now. But let's act like this. Let's not act like this wasn't happening. We know that this was anything that is GPS, anything that was Storm Shadow, anything that was ATACMS, anything that was HIMARS, and as well, any satellite imagery and stuff here as well. Let's not act like there hasn't been intel sharing on this, but now it's becoming more official. First time, the Trump administration will aid with these strikes. US has long assisted Kyiv with drone and missile strikes, but now against refineries, pipelines, power stations, and other infrastructure, the goal of depriving the Kremlin of oil revenue to sustain its invasion. And again, this was the original Wonderwaffe, and this is becoming the new one. Again, what will we see? Time will tell us. They're weighing sending Tomahawks, Barracudas, and other missiles with a range around 500 miles. Tomahawks, I believe, have a range of about 2,500 kilometers. Barracudas, these come in, I believe, 3 different versions. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's a 150, 250, and 500. No decision on what to send has been made. So will we say it, will we not? In my honest opinion on this, given the scalability of making more of these systems, how many there are, and that a lot of these systems are easier to shoot down in smaller numbers than actually large-scale drone swarms going, I still don't see why the industry is not more. I do see it on the monetary aspect, but I don't see why there's not more like, hey, let's just mobilize more European American industry and just give Ukraine 1,000 Garand-style drones a day flying into these oil refineries that have limited air defense coverage just because of how large Russia is. Again, we will see. Now, let's talk about this. I'm going to belt feed through a little bit of information here. France 24, France detains 2 crew members of a Russian-linked tanker off the western French coast, suspected of being involved in drone overflights. This happened about 12 hours from recording this video. You can see the date here, but of course, you and I are going to be in different time zones. Now, there were some serious offences committed by this crew, which justify current judicial procedure from Mr. Macron. Now, this is something we've been speaking about. And what doesn't add up is the Shadow Fleet, these tankers, whatever you want to call it, these are very, very important to Russia. Why would they risk these ships by launching drones off them? But on the other side, you need then justification to then go and seize these ships too. Now, let's have a look over a couple of things. Let's start here. This is the UN territorial sea and contiguous zone of what it would take to actually go against these ships. So practices of weapons, any threat of use of force of sovereignty and territorial integrity, launching, landing, and taking off aboard any military device, launching, landing, and taking aboard any aircraft. Okay, so you can see what it takes to then intercept these. You see Zelensky 3 days ago saying intelligence now indicates Russians are moving tankers to launch and operate drones against European countries. Of course, while we've seen more unidentified flying objects flying around Europe, there is more evidence why the Baltic Sea and underseas must be closed to Russian tankers, at least the Shadow Fleet. So this was all a couple of days ago. And then back on the 4th of August, we had Sputnik saying this with an exclusive with the Russian SVR that there will be some level of attack to give a casus belli to intercept and stop these tankers through passages, which gives sufficient justification to establish a precedent for emergency checks of vessels, ostensibly to verify compliance and maritime safety and environmental regulations. So ostensibly. So it looks like it is this, although it's not exactly that. It appears to be the truth for it. So we got this back then. And again, I don't trust bloody anyone on this. I don't trust anyone. I don't trust the SVR. I don't trust this. I don't trust that. What I do trust is myself to go, what makes more sense in this? Who is to benefit? Who is to not? And you start getting highly suspicious on some of this. Furthermore, Zelensky today, he also put out a tweet 2 days ago about the ZNPP, the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. But again, today, Zelensky says a Russian strike on one of our energy substations in Slavutich caused a blackout lasting more than 3 hours at the former Chernobyl nuclear power plant facilities. The Russians could not have been unaware that striking facilities in here would have such consequence on Chernobyl. They're saying they knew this. Estimates indicate the Russian-Iranian Shaheeds. No, it is a Garan. It's not a Shaheed. It's bought the licensing from Iran. It's going to there. But you can see why you're creating that. Multiple countries, blah, blah, blah. That makes sense. Blackout at the ZNPP continues into its 8th day. It began due to Russian shelling, claiming that Russia is shelling the ZNPP, where there are IAEA inspectors, but also that Russia hold and not allowing Ukrainian specialists to restore external power here. So you can see all this. He's calling it a global threat against these nuclear facilities. It's crucial that European countries, the US, G7 and G20 nations take real action for peace. And again, you can see when you look through the lens I am of creating casus belli for more justification, showing a provocation, however, where red flags start going up. But the problem with all of this is the boy that cried wolf scenario. Is you don't know if the SVR is having a, hey, look, we've picked up interceptions with MI6 about this, but you also, or it is just an intel op in itself to justify something. But on this same side, on the other side, you don't know if Zelensky's going, hey, look, they're fucking shelling this area, or they're shelling on here to create an incident to draw in more countries. What makes more sense? Russia risking the shadow fleet or drawing in NATO countries kinetically, or Ukraine carrying out some event to draw in more support or kinetic action. And again, it's heavily weighted that it makes more sense. I said yesterday in the video, and I'll continue saying it, this is what I would be doing, that I completely get the situation, the critical nature of this. If I was sitting in an intelligence service in Kyiv, I'd be going, we need some way of bringing in extra support, because France and Germany and Italy and America, they're just drip feeding parts in. If we're going to clear back to these territories, which now the precedent has been set from Trump, because Trump actually tied Ukraine's hands by saying Ukraine can do this and take more, that now everyone's gone, sweet, this is available, this is capable to do. It makes sense. Exactly like I've said on the reverse. If we suddenly saw that there was if there's a weapons plant in China and this has been hit and people are pinning it, I'd say, look, if Russia was in the position Ukraine is at the moment and we saw an explosion in China, I know where I'd be looking at straight off the bat. So let's have a look at the maps. Of course, we're in the beginning of October, which I know is absolutely insane. In 2 days' time is actually the 12 months since I got my head cut open, but let's look here. Now, Deep State, they released their numbers. Russia occupied, according to their maps, 259 square kilometres over September, which is less than half their advances in July. 53% of the territory occupied is in the Novopavlivka front, around that Velika area. You can see this right down here over the months of 550, 450, and then 260. Now, John Helen, who is very reliable on this, he says, well, our assessment differs quite considerably. Now, what we'll be doing is we'll also compare AMK and Syriac. What we do know is Deep State has a hell of a lot of grey zone when we move on to the maps right around this whole front. So we have Novopavlivka sitting in here, but this whole area in here, a lot of grey zone and a lot of ignoring other areas. But let's have a look then at what Mr. Thorkill says. DS, this Deep State data and analysis, due to significant delays in their maps, are compared with compilations of Russian Telegram account, Creamy Caprice. These are the two shown together. These paints an entirely different story. According to Creamy Caprice, Russians captured just under 500 square kilometres in September, marking the first increase in their pace of territorial advances since May 25, but by just under 100 square kilometres. The Russians achieved the largest territorial gains in the following directions: Liman direction, Kremlin Forest, Ternay, Pokrovsk, Novopavlivsky, Huliapol, Melanivkia areas. Conclusions. As seen above, we have two completely different sets of data and opposing pictures of the situation emerging from them, pseudo-environments that can be created. Let everyone judge for themselves which compilations are more reliable. What I will say is Creamy Caprice, every single movement on Creamy Caprice is off a geolocation. That's one of the main areas I get my geolocations. Now, the Creamy Caprice advancements is the inclusion of gains around Huliapol, which were entirely omitted from Deep State's map, as well as the Pokrovsk area, where Deep State has practically ceased updating territorial changes since the August the 15th. For example, take Bilyahida area south of Konstantinivka. Despite a 10 different geolocations report over the past 3 weeks indicating Russia's capture of the Hill 203 and adjacent garden plots, as well as reaching this area is not being marked on Deep State's map, not even in grey zone. So, of course, we have where the Deep State one is sitting in here. You see the lowest for some time. But then we have Creamy Caprice. Now, I've translated this from Russian to English. We see this, that he's saying it's the second highest since May. There's actually been an increase in ground over the past months, coming to September at 492. So you get an idea of where this movement is. Now, Creamy Caprice, as I've said, they're actually behind Deep State on a lot of areas because there's not a geolocation to show this. And a lot of areas are highly ignored, especially around Velika, especially around Konstantinivka, by Deep State. So let's actually have a look. We have a couple of days of maps. So we're back here on the first, of course, red zones. These are occupied since 22. The purple since 2014. The red check, of course, is ground made over a 24-hour period, but this is being back on the first. Verbove, Ternove, and Novahorivka, these areas further coming under control by the Russian forces. Again, very, very healthy dose of grey zone in here. Now, what do I think? I think that over now that we've tipped into October, there's going to be a trickle feed of the actual red zone into these areas, because I do not believe in a map like this, in a war like this, you will get 16 plus kilometers of grey zone. But you can see that movement there. We come up then to today, further grey zone, further red zone, Poltavka movement, Novunevka movement, as well as further grey zone shift around Sosnivska as well. Now let's come into Verbove. Let me show you a geolocation in here. We have 3 flags going up to the extent of the grey zone in here, and this is one of the flags going up by Russian forces just there. We zoom back out. I spoke about Poltavka, the red zone moving into there. We look on the Suryak map, and there's confirmation of further movement into Poltavka. Now, let's move our way to Pokrovsk. Now, what we're going to look at is there's no actual changes on this, but let's have a look at the grey zone changes. So, firstly, let's actually focus on Pokrovsk actual, and we have this. You see, there's this small amount of this doodle of grey heading out in here. I wonder what that could be, and I'm sure it's a little bit embarrassing for this bloke. He hasn't done his 6-foot wall climb in a while, that we see this Russian soldier here struggling a little bit to get into this window. Come on, mate, launch with the feet. It is high. There's no way I could do that in gear. Again, remember, guys, physical ability doesn't matter in battlefield like this. Over your head, say, if he's 6 foot tall, say that's a 6 and a bit foot wall there. Physical ability in gear, that is fucking hard. You people do not understand. If you're in body armor with water, with 2 grenades, with 7 magazines, all of this, and a weapon and all, it's delusional how fit people think that you are, and how fit you actually have to be in the military. You'll never be as fit. Anyway, we see that geolocation, that's right out into this area. But let's look up here, as we do have some blue popping up, as well as some red disappearing. So we have in Rubizhne area, Novashakhovka, then these areas being by Deep State saying that these are controlled by Ukraine. But remember, all the other mappers, who I will say are far more reliable, they are saying Dorozhne and Nikhorovka, that these areas are under control by the Russian forces. And further advancements around Mayak, which is directly contradicts this map. Grey zone through the bottom here, showing a cut-off blue zone introduction, but again, completely ignoring any movement on the Sofivka area here. So again, keep an eye on this. This, in my opinion, is the hardest area to get an idea of what it actually looks like. But we do see that this movement on the north, movement on the eastern side to the north, could really start trapping this envelopment that's happened in here. Now, let's move down to Konstantinivka. Now, let's have a look here. Now, the maps I don't use that much, but I believe he's pretty good, is Mr. Playfair. But again, when we're showing just one source of mapping, whether it be Deep State, whether they're showing that cutoff and that blue, or whether it is just one source, again, that does not meet our threshold. But this is highly concerning. Let's look at Klen Bik down in here. Of course, this is from Toretsk Konstantinivka pocket. He is claiming this. Russian forces have captured Klen Bik, corrected the contact line in the fields to the south of the reservoir. The remaining forces are cut off and will need and are forced to retreat by boat. So Klen Bik in here, he's saying this has come under control. Now again, this isn't that extreme from the map. So this is grey zone up to the reservoir, which is the reservoir here. Kateryivka, we've seen multiple geolocations in here. We've seen multiple geolocations out here. He has said that this has come under control, and we know there's Ukrainian forces in here. We've heard complaints about, hey, we can't supply anything. We saw a video of Azov picking up and taking many wounded down this only road into here and here. And if this is correct, this is the potential for an absolute bloodbath in here. Now, I don't give a shit what other bloggers who haven't served in combat corps or who are fucking delusional say about crossing reservoirs and stuff like this on boats. Will be absolutely catastrophic if that is what's going to have to take place in a drone and artillery space like this. But let's look at Konstantinivka actual. Sopochki, Predechny, Alexander Shultny, this showing vastly different on the deep state compared to many other maps. Now, he's showing further advancement, and he claimed the battle for Konstantinivka has begun, but he says extremely heavy 24/7 Russian bombardment continue in this district just on the eastern side. That it's being flattened. Russian forces really want to enter that part of the city, confirming public suspicions. These bombardments are also to be considered as very strong fire preparation. This part of the front line is currently rainy and muddy, though, which could complicate Russian advancements in the area. Again, this bombardment, what we see is exactly like I went over in my tactics of hold, destroy, exploit. Hold in place with drones. Drones are not going to be, most drones are not going to be punching through then fortified positions or basements, but you can hold people in them. You just land FABs or heavier artillery on these areas, and then you exploit that following. So keep an eye on this whole area in here. Now, final map. God, we might be under half an hour. Let's move our way up into Zadashne Torshke area. Zadashne here again, labeling disappears and comes and goes. AMK, he's saying that the Russian forces have captured this Zadashne area, of course, on this whole flank of Seversk. Of course, very, very important. But what we do know, people just need to zoom out and see the developing envelopments that are occurring. There is the very start of envelopments around Huliapol and in the Zaporizhia direction. We, of course, have Novopavlivka, we have Pokrovsk, we have Konstantinivka, we have Siversk, we have Borova, we have Kupiansk. There's multiple here. Now, you need to apply standards the same. If the front line looked the other way, you would be saying, there's no reason to close these up if they're going to keep pumping forces in. This is a war of attrition. Your primary goal is to reduce the power of your enemy, not gain kilometre squares. I have said I would not be surprised if we see very, very small kilometre squares shifts, and then we see some very big months once these areas have either had a withdrawal or collapse. Legends, you have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.